the way we acclimatize, the single gold standard to acclimatization is to progressively move higher to where your body feels the suffering of not being acclimatized. That stimulates hormones, which tell your body it needs to make more red blood cells and make these other physiological changes. And then we need to drop back down low enough on the mountain that the body is not struggling. So you need to go back down to an altitude where your body is completely or mostly comfortable, and then rest and sit around and do nothing so your body can put all its energy and resources into making those changes, then go up again, not to the altitude you went before, but progressively a bit higher to where once again hormones are stimulated to tell your body make more changes, then go back down and rest and do it over and over and over again. Hello and welcome to the Duffel Shuffle. I'm Adrian Ballinger, and we're here to discuss the world of climbing and skiing in all its forms through the eyes of mountain guides.
And I'm Sam Kiekeffer. In each episode, we'll unpack exhilarating stories, share invaluable insights, and get up close and personal with some of the most experienced and passionate guides and athletes in the industry.
Whether you're a seasoned alpinist or a weekend warrior, the Duffel Shuffle is your ticket to the thrilling world of climbing, skiing, and mountaineering. Join us.
All right, welcome back to episode 15 of the Duffel Shuffle podcast. Adrian, where are you?
We're going to really challenge our tech on this one. Let's see if Starlink does what it says it does, even when surrounded by huge trees and massive rock cliffs. I'm deep in Yosemite Valley in my van.
On. Last we spoke, you had just gotten back from Yosemite. Now you're back in the valley, climbing again. How's the weather down there?
Yeah, exactly. Spent 10 days at home, got a bunch of work done with Alpenglow, a little bit of training, and lots of daddying time while Emily was out for a week. It was really great just to be one-on-one solo with the kid, actually. And then we came back here 2 nights ago, had a fantastic day of climbing, and then it unleashed last night. Might have rained like, I don't know, half an inch, lots of wind. It was beautiful. So we're taking the day off today while things dry here in the valley. But I think high pressure, warm temps, above average temps coming back for the next at least 10 days. And we'll be here.
Right on. Yeah, we got a little bit of snow up here in the mountains last night. It snowed and then it started raining, so we've woke up to some nice slop, but I'm sure it was all snow somewhere at some elevation and kind of making it feel like winter's approaching.
Definitely. I mean, I was impressed, by the way. I have to admit, I woke up, fired up the Starlink, and looked at the webcams on Palisades, and I was impressed. There was a bunch of snow up there. I am sure there's someone trying to make turns in grass. And yeah, I'm sure there's snow in the high country here in Tuolumne. But looking forward to winter. But actually, I'm sure I've said this on the podcast before. Like, I will stretch warm, high pressure, California rock climbing as long as I can. So hopefully another 2 or 3 weeks to go.
I think you'll get it.
Winter will be long whenever it comes. We know that.
Exactly.
Especially since, I mean, you're similar to me. Like, I'll go through winter. Let's say winter starts in December and I ski until mid or late April. And then I go into Everest and it's another 5 or 6 weeks of like extreme winter, even though it's spring there. So I know my winter's going until June, probably middle of June. So yeah, I'll take this as long as I can. And you,
no rush.
What are your winter plans this year?
I'll be mostly in Tahoe, although I am going to be in Japan. Actually, that's totally a lie. I'm not mostly going to be in Tahoe.
See you next summer, Sam.
I will start my winter out in Tahoe, and then I'm going to be going to Japan for about a month, guiding in Japan, ski guiding, and then I'll come back and I quickly head up to the Tetons for a week to teach a Pro 1 course. And then back in Tahoe for a month or so. And then I'm headed to Canada for a boys trip with a bunch of buddies. So I get to finish my kind of winter off with a nice, fun personal trip in Canada. And then it kind of, it's funny, like I break my winter up into 2 parts. We've got like winter, and then spring winter activities.
Mm.
So I'll come back from Canada in early April, and that's when kind of Shasta and Eastern Sierra season really tees off. And, that, like you were saying, it can go till mid-June, no problem. And we could be skiing till mid-June. Although that's nice because you're like finishing your ski day in a t-shirt and maybe never putting a beanie on in the morning type skiing.
Yeah, it's kind of the opposite of this rock climbing here, where we're starting every day in like 4 down jackets. I'm using my lens heated socks, like
No
when we're
way.
out cragging. It's like, it's such a cold sink here in the valley. Once you get a couple 100 feet off the ground in the valley, the temps really warm up. But we're definitely climbing on the sunny side now, and mornings are, yeah, like legit winter cold. Um,
But
but
not
you
lens heated socks cold. Come
not for
on.
anyone else on the planet, but for me, if I, with all the frost damage that I've had on my feet, especially my left foot, if I can, I'm going to be in really tight climbing shoes, trying to perform at a decently high level for me. So, I mean, standing on really small things, and numb toes just make that almost impossible, numb wooden toes. So, if I can really, really rewarm well while Emily's climbing, so between my pitches, then I can just feel much more uh, when I'm climbing. So my lens socks are really like out for the season, and I'm using them when we're single pitch cragging. Obviously, not
Yeah,
when we're going higher on the wall. And I'm not wearing them while I'm climbing. I'm wearing them while I'm belaying. But
that's awesome. So what are your
truly, I
winter
mean, they're
plans?
game changing. Uh, yeah, winter plans. It's funny. I now know why the scheduling team in the Alpenglow office is annoyed at you. You're here all winter, and then you give us that schedule
But I'm working
uh,
for Alpenglow for a
for
lot
a
of that.
lot of
So
it. Absolutely, we should mention that. I can't remember if we talked about Japan last year or on this podcast before, but it's so funny. I just love, we've been running ski trips through Alpenglow, of course, in Tahoe in California, but to big mountains around the world for quite a while, and they tend to be terrible skiing. And finally, I think I've been beaten down to where we had to offer some great skiing in our international program at Alpenglow. And so Japan is kind of the second of that after Chile. And you're going to be running one or two
two
trips over
trips
there.
back to back. Yeah.
Japan is just such a pull. I obviously spent a month there a couple of years ago and loved it. And it's probably the place where I get asked the most by friends, clients, uh, like how it was, and they want to go there. So really excited to see those inaugural Alpenglow trips launch.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to it. I've never been, but
Oh
I
wow.
think it'll be a great trip.
You will enjoy it. It's like Rubicon Jakes and Tallac all day, every day, with a 10 to 12-inch refresh every single night.
That's what I was made for.
It's so amazing. And for listeners not in the Tahoe area, those are kind of like our classic treed shots here in Tahoe that we backcountry ski a lot. And they're just fantastic, perfect pitch for thousands of feet through perfectly spaced trees. Like, as far as I'm concerned, as good as like moderate skiing, backcountry skiing comes in the United States. And Japan is just filled with that. A lot of fun, moderate hazard, pretty special. But you asked my winter. I'm planning on splitting my winter between Tahoe and Andermatt, Switzerland. This will be our fourth winter, spending a chunk of time in Andermatt. We'll go for the month of February this year. But I am trying to stay a little closer to home, especially as I start thinking about training for a bigger objective in 2025, having a lot of other pieces of my life kind of like stable, like in a house with childcare, with Emily having a fantastic climbing gym for her to be able to do her training in. That makes it easier to pull the time that I need to walk slowly up hills day after day after day.
Right on. And I'm sure you'll be in Red Rocks a little bit, doing some climbing, bouncing back and forth.
Yeah, especially when I mean, if the snow is not 100% in Tahoe, then we tend to spend quite a bit of time down in Vegas with great friends there and fantastic rock climbing. So for sure, that'll be part of the mix.
Awesome. Well, this episode, we kind of wanted to talk about some of the leading climbs of the last year. It's that time of year where the Piolets d'Or winners were just announced. The ceremony will be in December, but they've announced the three climbs that were picked as the top climbs of I guess 2023.
That's right.
Um, and that's a list of 60 finalists. So, I think it's worth noting that any Piolets d'Or finalist has done an amazing job, and it's a phenomenal accomplishment. But those top three winners is really impressive.
Yeah. So, and for those not familiar, I mean, obviously, alpinism is not a sport. There aren't referees. Theoretically, it's not competition between different teams, and there are very few rules, even though I'd say there are standards or ethics in the sport. But the PLA door or the Golden Ice Axe is a award that's been around for a long time now, where a jury of really well respected older alpinists get together, ask for submissions, kind of look at the best climbs of the previous year, and then choose what they think were the most notable. They might be the most notable because they were the hardest or a completely unclimbed face, or mountains are very so many unknowns, or a really unique team, or very uh, unknown climbing at high altitudes. Lots of different things weigh into it, and the first thing I think each year when I see this list, especially the 60 nominees, is like alpinism is alive and well. I think, we hear sometimes about how like exploration is dead, or climbing isn't like it used to be, or it's all about gyms and safety and, you know, parkour bouldering and, things like this. And then you see this list, and there are just so many young, incredible climbers pushing the limits on so many different peaks and in ranges around the world. And, one of the nice things about the list is most of the time, even I, deeply in the sport, I'm like, I need to look up who these people are oftentimes. And also what these mountains are. So it'd be very rare to see a PLA door from Everest. It's of course possible if a new route was put up in alpine style on Everest. If and when that happens, I'm sure it will be nominated.
But
But the
even that
three,
wouldn't be a guarantee, right? I mean, I think that's the cool part about the Piolets d'Or is like, you have Everest, the tallest mountain in the world, arguably the most iconic mountain in the world, and a new route on Everest isn't a slam dunk for a Piolets d'Or necessarily. It's some of these climbs are just obscure and challenging and complicated and take, so much more
yeah,
out of people.
absolutely. So you can sort of anticipate, especially, when you look at the list, generally any PLA door nominee is going to have been climbed in alpine style. So no fixed ropes or limited fixed ropes. And, once you go for your summit push, starting from the bottom, going to the top, they're almost always you're going to spend multiple nights on the face, and it'll be on an unclimbed route, and often or usually on an unclimbed face or mountain. So three winners this year. I'll do my best to pronounce the names of the routes, at least, or peaks. One from Tirik Mir, I believe that was in Pakistan, Janu in Nepal, and then Flat Top in India. And unfortunately, of the three winners for 2023, one of the teams, Kazuya Hiradi and Kenro Nakajima, who won for Tirik Mir, were killed this year in 2024 on the west face of K2. So there is kind of a sad piece to this as well. And I think perhaps that's worth speaking to just a little bit. The winners on Janu, I think two of the three also had some pretty significant frostbite in their climb. And then so American climbers on Janu, Japanese climbers on Tirik Mir, and then Swiss climbers on Flat Top, some young, really impressive Swiss climbers. But this list, like I said, it excites me so much. I also think it needs to be taken um, it with an understanding of all the loss and tragedy that has happened in the alpine climbing world this year, last year, the last decade, my entire career. I think I think there's more to be discussed here. We are losing a remarkable number of alpinists, and I don't actually think that's new to this generation. It's just the internet and the mass media appeal of alpine climbing and high mountains means that we hear so much more from these climbs that used to be, as you said earlier, really obscure and unknown, except for a tiny little group of people who mostly lived in Chamonix. And now we all hear about these accidents from, just today we heard that one of the climbers on Langtang Lurung was killed after putting up a new route, 6 days on the face, new route, incredible ascent. He was killed falling into a crevasse on the descent of the mountain. Of course, the winners of this year's PLA door killed on K2. Um, One a little closer to home, although I never had the chance to climb with him, Mike Gardner, uh, who was just killed a few weeks ago, and it was just seen as such an up and coming light of American alpinism. And we could just keep going and going and going, right? So I think it's important to recognize the really outsized risk that cutting edge alpinism has always taken and still takes today.
Yeah, I mean it's it's bittersweet. We're celebrating these people who are accomplishing amazing things, but you cannot accomplish these things without taking that risk. Like you said, it's um, a necessary evil, and at what level do we stop is kind of the question, because that limit, that barrier is going to keep getting pushed, and it's going to slowly move a little bit higher and a little bit higher, and where's the ceiling? And you've got a couple of years on me, so you've seen the history of this a little bit longer. But I do agree that it seems like, and maybe it's just the media is putting it out there more, and we're gathering information faster this day and age. But it does seem like lately it's alpinism is catching up with base jumping and wingsuiting and all those other extremely dangerous sports, and that all the leaders are passing away in the mountains or doing what they love.
Yeah, and I think it's important conversation to continue having. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this recently as I continue to think about taking risk in the ways I do in the mountains while having an almost 2-year-old son. And uh, for sure, I don't have any solutions or answers. I I am not convinced there's any more percentage wise uh, death today or danger than there was 20 years ago when I was trying to climb at a really high level and trying to do first ascents and things like that in South America and Nepal, or 30 years ago when Vince Anderson, Steve House, and Mark Twight were the names of our day, or, even, of course, we lost Alex Lowe. Um, so I'm going to hazard an unsupported guess that it is no more dangerous today. Um, I'm also going to, I guess, I think it's very important for us to be considering risk and to be incredibly honest about risk and to lay out what these risks are. At the same time, I'm in no way saying that I think a 20 something climber who is absolutely, or a 30 something, the age is sort of irrelevant, but someone who's absolutely convinced this is the most important thing in their life and they've put time and energy and passion into, and they recognize the very clear risks that are out there, which is why I think it's so important we tell these stories of the accidents as well as the heroics and successes. I think it's completely cool and amazing for people to continue to go and take those outsized risks. And I would never want to say they shouldn't. I just think it's also important to share the times when it no longer feels worth it as individuals, and that should also be celebrated, hopefully. So celebrating the ones who feel that outsized risk is worth it, also celebrating those. I think Steve House is a great example of someone who very um confidently and kind of like loudly said, I'm done, I have a family, I'm done, and he hasn't ever gone back on that. I think I just heard recently on Climbing Gold, Jamie Logan, one of the really strong climbers of many generations, both in the alpine world and the rock climbing world. And she said, one of these, of course, sort of cliche-ish lines about, about alpinists, that they're either dead or they quit, right? And but that's obvious. That could be a 50-year long career, or it could be a 10-year long career and then quitting. But those are the only two options. I think there is so much random risk in this sport. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I think if there's anything with age that I've learned that I denied for decades, mostly to my mom, but also to interviews and younger climbers, like I denied that luck was the main reason I was still here.
Mm-hmm.
It was about my skills, my decision making. I was more conservative than my friends. Um, I was stronger, I was faster, all these different things. And now, with a little bit of perspective, I think all those things are very important to success and just a huge fucking dose of luck. And so if there's anything I want, like when I think about my kid and whether my kid's going to get into alpinism or something like that, like if that's his path, that's his path. But I want him to know from day one that it wasn't skill or talent that kept me alive or a lot of our friends alive. It was also luck. And that's got to be worth it.
In thinking about the Piole d'Or, one of the things that allows us to continue to push the limit and climb harder climbs is technology and the equipment that we use. Do you think that the advances in technology are matching or trailing or exceeding the advances in technical difficulty that is being climbed?
Such a great question. And again, we need a data scientist now, right? Except probably the pool is so small, it's very hard to pull out any actual conclusions. My feeling is certain sides of technology are making things much safer, especially weather forecasting, communications, and helicopter technology. Like we can rescue people from so much higher today with in really bad accidents. We can learn about the vast majority of storms and wind events before they happen, so we're not caught up high on faces. And then how much lighter everything's gotten just enables us to move over terrain more quickly. And speed is often safety in the mountains. That is another cliche, which actually holds true. So I think technology in all those ways have made things much safer. But then, like you said, it also means we can climb much steeper things, much more exposed things, be out on much larger peaks, or not larger, but bigger lines, potentially with less support, things that used to be siege styled and now alpine styled and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it probably balances out. I think humans have always been pushing. The best climbers have always been at the very edge of survival, of life and death. That's where I've always believed the most learning happens in our climbing, right? That's like another line that I use in a lot of my slideshows and things like that. Like that is the line you're searching for. And everyone's always been searching for that. So we've always gone to the max technology has allowed. But no, very few people like just want to die in the mountains, right? Like everyone wants to come home. And so people are trying not to push past that line. I don't think it's changed at all, even though the types of things we see being climbed might be different today than decades ago.
Absolutely. Well, spectacular to see some of these climbs and read about them, hear about them. The Piole d'Or award ceremonies will be in December, so congratulations to really all the finalists and especially these three that have won the Piole d'Or.
Yeah, I just really encourage people to look up these three climbs, but also all 60. I think it's just an incredible way to get totally inspired and also totally psyched about this wild sport that we play in, and also hopefully have a little dose of humility to what's out there at the edge. Coming up, we have a conversation about one of my favorite things: high altitude. Sam and I share our first experiences with altitude, what we've found works for us and doesn't work, a bit about pre acclimatization, and much more. So stay tuned. Today's podcast is brought to you by Alpenglow Expeditions, a Tahoe based guide company with an international reputation. In its 20th year of operations, Alpenglow leads the highest quality expeditions in some of the world's greatest mountain ranges, from California's High Sierra to the rugged Himalaya. Alpenglow runs more than 40 international expeditions per year, as well as offering a full menu of guided ski and climbing courses throughout California. Join us and experience the Alpenglow difference. Welcome back, Sam. We decided today to talk about our very favorite thing in the world: high altitude.
Oh yeah, I know it's your favorite. I think I'm a fan. I am a fan, actually. I totally take that back. I'm a fan, but maybe not to the same level as you.
Well, it turns out that, my intense mediocrity at all things sport at sea level get progressively slightly less mediocre as I go higher. So of course I self-selected to spend as much as my life as I could up there.
Well, but in reality, all jokes aside, do you think that part of why you have been attracted to high altitude is it gives you some sort of advantage, or you're better at altitude than maybe other people?
Sure, of course. I mean, I think high altitude for everyone includes a large piece of like intense yet low grade suffering that goes for hours and hours or days and days or weeks and weeks. And so naturally, like either I just happen because of my upbringing or whatever to enjoy suffering or feel like I deserve to suffer and therefore put up with it better than many other people, or my genetics, and the fact that I acclimatized pretty quickly to new altitudes and that I've never really struggled with headaches, strangely, which is one of the very biggest obvious symptoms of high altitude. I'm guessing that biological and genetic side is also part of it, where I am actually suffering less than a lot of my partners, clients, co-guides, friends. Those two things together meant that, yeah, I felt like, I could keep pushing up there and have opportunities to do things that were really hard for me, but also I was really proud of. Um, and then that all ties to like the reason why I think high altitude is so cool, which is that like there are so few known outcomes. There's so much like problem solving that has to happen every day. And I think in a very different way, like I've loved athletics since I was a kid, but when I played all these other sports or did things like road running like my dad did, or run crew like I did in college, or playing tennis like I did through high school, like I had a very physical side involved in those activities. Of course, there's mental like strategy and things like that. But the emotional side for me, where there wasn't this sense of risk or very clear danger, when that was pulled out of the activity, my emotional experience in those things has never met what I feel at high altitude. And I
Hmm.
think that was an essential piece of the puzzle for me.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that. I kind of agree with you that altitude creates this new dimension, and whether that's impacting you physically or nutritionally or emotionally, it's this other factor, kind of like weather, where you have zero control at times, and it's just going to come in and either mess things up or challenge you in a different way than without it. It's an uncontrollable factor.
It's uncontrollable in many ways, or at least unknown, I think. And we do, we sometimes call it like this leveling of the playing field, right? It while athleticism and training, of course, is one piece of being successful at altitude, it can surprise us. Like I'm still surprised as a guide at who performs really well on my trips and who sometimes doesn't. And I think there's both that genetic piece that we've kind of touched on or suggested that there is a genetic piece. So until you spend time at progressively higher altitudes, you don't know whether you will excel at it or not physiologically. And then I just think there's such a huge piece about it that has to do with how well you suffer and how willing you are to let go of being in control of everything. That, that it's often true that like the best, most trained athlete who competes at a really high level likes to be in control actually, and
Mm-hmm.
often struggles at altitude. And the classic story I always tell is like the pack a day Alaskan crab fisherman that I had on Everest back in 2009, I think. And I was like, he's probably 40 pounds overweight. I'm like, there's no way this guy doesn't have it. And as everyone got weaker going up the mountain, he just got stronger and stronger. And he wasn't like building muscle, or like, of course, he was losing fat because we all lose weight, but he was actually like excelling as the suffering became greater. And I was like, oh, he spent 30 years of his life learning how to suffer and still get the job done. And it just worked at altitude. all that to say, I just love that we don't know going in how people will perform.
Yeah, I mean, I think Corey Richards talked about that in episode 7. It's like at a certain level, he actually starts to excel where other people just really start to suffer and dig their heels in. And yeah, it is interesting to hear about those unique stories. Certainly, I would say those individuals are the anomalies. That's not typical for people to kind of find that extra gear, but at the same time, those special few are out there.
Absolutely. And Corey is one of the best examples. Definitely an episode to go back and listen to, episode 7. Like you said, Sam, Corey is one of those incredible performers as he goes higher and higher. I think and I think we should be careful. I very much do not think it's just like, oh, he's got genetics. I could never be that way. Let's just say he's lucky, because I think it has so much to do with like mental and emotional strength. And that's something I want to endeavor to when I see that, versus being like, oh, he just got born lucky.
Yeah, but I do. I mean, I think you can put two people in the room in the controlled environment. They train the same. They have the same level of fitness. They eat the same. They do all the same things, and one person is going to do better than the other every single time. And it
Mm,
might not be the same person. You put them in that environment two different times, and maybe one of them excels one time and one of them excels the other time. But I
mm.
do think like you put identical people out there and the altitude is going to be this different factor, and some people do have a genetic difference there.
Yeah, certainly there is a genetic piece, but I think what you said, I agree with, but I think that actually has a lot to do with that like fortitude, that
Mm-hmm.
strength of character that may change from time to time. I mean, Corey's a
Yep.
great example of that. He successfully climbed without supplemental oxygen in 16 and then failed in 17 trying to do the exact same thing on a better day.
Yeah.
And he would be the first to say that like when the goal wasn't as important to him, like the mental strength in the face of huge suffering just wasn't there.
Yep.
Um, I think we can't underestimate that part. The other thing, and I think maybe this is a lead into some of the things we've learned from doing this for decades, both personally and guiding. So seeing hundreds of people uh, acclimatizing and climbing high altitude peaks, the vast majority of people can acclimatize to very high altitudes. There's some question whether no oxygen on Everest, there might be some ceilings there, like some people who just can't. Uh, but the vast majority of altitudes that we're playing at on all these peaks around the world, everyone can acclimate. The majority of people can acclimatize. It's a matter of how long it takes and how painful that process is.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there's a single learning that I pull out before we talk about pre-acclimatization, before we talk about medications that can help, before we talk about all those things, it is like find your own pace. And that means not
Yeah.
only like walking or running or climbing pace, but it means like how many nights you need at each progressive altitude before moving up, and how often you need to drop back down to recover before doing it again in this process of acclimatization. There is a huge spectrum. I know because I've had to do it in rescue situations with my company. Like I can go from essentially sea level to summit a 20,000-foot peak with no pre acclimatization in 48 hours. There are a lot of people that would be a really bad idea for, but it doesn't mean they can't climb at 20,000 feet. It just means it might take 5 days, like our normal non pre acclimatized high altitude peaks that we run through Alpenglow. But then there's a failure rate on those trips, right? That summit on day 6 or day 7, because for some people, it will take 8 or 9 days to be able to summit a 20,000-foot peak without their head exploding. And so I think being truly, what's the word? Like honoring one's own body and acclimatization rate is the absolute key to success in this sport.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll share a quick story. I learned that firsthand. My first altitude experience was on Cotopaxi in Ecuador um, in 2019, and I felt great. I did well. I was on a rapid ascent trip, so I had pre-acclimatized. We were at the summit of Cotopaxi, I think 4 days after I departed from Reno here in the Tahoe area. And I felt fantastic. I had no issues. It was great. And so 2 years later, I went back in 2021, actually for your wedding. But my wife and I went a couple weeks early to do some climbing on our own and just do a little added vacation on the front end of your trip. And I was like, all right, let's go up Cayembe. It's a little bit shorter than Cotopaxi. I took Alpenglow's kind of standard trip schedule of acclimatization. I trimmed a couple days off. I trimmed some rest off because that's what you do, right?
Ah, you're a
Um,
mountain guide. You're a badass.
and we acclimatized. We climbed Ruku Pinchincha. My wife was feeling pretty good. 15,500 feet, a little bit higher than she'd been in the lower 48, but not by a significant amount. Felt good. We went to Fuya Fuya. She felt good. We went up to Cayembe. We went to the glacier. She felt good at around 16,500 feet. And then on our summit push, a good 6 days after we arrived in Ecuador, which typically with Alpenglow we're doing 7 or 8. So I was, a day or two faster. She just got hit at 18.3. It was like the e-brake was pulled and screeching halt. Um, and I was feeling good, and I just at that moment I realized that I have been able to acclimatize a little bit faster than most people, and
Yes.
maybe I shouldn't have pushed our schedule for my wife's first experience at those altitudes. Um, you know, we then came down, we joined the trip for your and Emily's wedding. We did some more acclimatization, and unfortunately, we had some weather challenges on Cotopaxi. But at 18.8, she was feeling fantastic because she'd had that extra time, and so
Yep.
higher elevation than when she kind of totally shut down on Cayembe, and she felt was like a different human because she just had a little bit more time to acclimatize.
Yeah, that's really it. It's such a great story to explain exactly how I think, especially on those early first times to altitude, everyone should approach it is like just knowing um, it is going to work. It just might take slightly different amounts of time. And really just going all the way back to my first time. This is also when I can show my age a little bit. Unfortunately, I think when was your first time to Cotopaxi? 2019?
2019.
Jeez. So my first time to Cotopaxi was in 1994. You weren't born yet?
I was 2 years old.
Perfect. Great. Uh I many people have heard this story before. I was going to school and a well-known climber named Chris Warner, kind of big mountain climber, was overseeing an outdoor leadership program at my college. And he had a cancellation of someone going to Cotopaxi, actually, Cotopaxi, Cayembe, and Chimborazo. Um, I was a freshman in college. So it was either 93 or 94. I was like 17 years old. And I had been interning for him on rock climbing programs and things like that in the US because I was already a climber. And when he had this cancellation, he called me a couple of days before Christmas and was like, if you can get on a plane in 4 days to Ecuador, you got a free trip to climb three 20,000-foot peaks. I was like, this is insane. And I'm also super fit. I was running crew for a Division 1 school, like training really hard. Had never been above 14,000 feet, never been out of the US. Um, Actually, I don't think I had been west yet, so I'd never been higher than Mount Washington, 6,000 feet, which I thought was rad. Went down there, I was with a bunch of, 50 something year olds, and I was like, I am going to crush these dudes. So I kind of didn't listen to a lot of the basic recommendations that came early in the trip. Um, didn't really go my own pace, didn't worry about like the headaches and nausea I was feeling, didn't really tell anyone.
I'm sure you were
Got
hydrated though.
Yeah, super hydrated, not drinking at all as like a 17-year-old where there's no drinking age in South America, or at least at the time in Ecuador. And so made this series of poor decisions, got myself put on the fast team of the different rope teams. I was going to be on the very fastest one because I was the strongest. And went up Cotopaxi, and ultimately my acute mountain sickness, my AMS symptoms continued to what was absolutely cerebral edema with just crushing headaches, really bad hallucinations, total confusion, and eventually like stumbling, slurring my words, things like that. Um, I ended up summiting, perhaps not the best mountain guiding decisions by my teammates at the time, but I ended up summiting. There's a story that on top, I was asking my teammates of why they had built condominiums in such a beautiful place on the summit of this 20,000-foot peak around the crater, which obviously there were no condominiums there. So I think my
In the
hallucinations
25 years between our ascents, they took the condos down, I'll tell you.
right in this national park. So I think I was quite confused and it ended up taking a lot of very hard work by my teammates to get me back down since I could no longer really walk down and had to be lowered and things like that. Um, all that to say, my first experience was not impressive on many different levels. Uh, and I almost went home at that point and luckily had the right people around me to be like, stay for a couple of days, process the experience. And a few days later, I was like, I went from being like, that was the worst thing that's ever happened to me, to like, that was the wildest experience of my life. And I learned so much and I can't wait to do it again. And much like the experience you just described, my second peak Cayembe was much better. And by the third peak Chimborazo, I was like on top of the world because my athleticism and my acclimatization were finally meeting. And I just knew like I had to do more of this.
Oh, that's awesome. So when in your career did you go from like, oh, I'm really into this, I enjoy this, to like, oh, I actually like do pretty well in this environment?
Yeah, I mean, so I finished college, graduated, started climbing full time, and that was both like US, like did a 3 month road trip in the US, but also through my mentor Chris, had the opportunity to go to Nepal, Peru, Ecuador, all in this like series. And I think it was in that really first year of doing back to back high altitude expeditions in 3 different countries around the world that I began to realize that not only did I love it, but that I also was good at it.
You
And
weren't
I
good at it. You were just doing back-to-back expeditions and never losing your acclimatization.
hey, that counts too. Um, and I was really connecting with like the experience of mountain guiding, like the problem solving of it. There was no structure back then. There were no employee handbooks. There were, you were just out in a country where there were essentially no communications and no weather forecasting with a group of people you had never met before. And you were going to put together a trip, keep everyone alive, and try to climb a really big mountain that doesn't even have maps to it. Like it was just a totally different time. And I loved it so much. So it had a lot to do with those other pieces of the puzzle that I really like connected to and was like, I want to keep building, keep building. And the beauty of this sport is like it's very obvious what the next benchmark is, right? It's like you climb 20,000 feet, you do well. Of course, you want to climb 22,000 feet and then 24,000 feet and then 26,000 feet. And so I just kept trying to chip away of that and get higher. At the same time, that was the time in my career where I was just so excited about the idea of like hard alpine climbing, new routes, things like that. So I was also working really hard to build my ice and mixed climbing skills to be able to try to put those things together.
Yeah, it's all the factors, right? We talked about the AMGA and the IFMGA in the last episode, and it's yeah, you have to put all those skills together in different environments at different altitudes, and work on them all at the same time.
Yeah, and this is really if this it is funny how this episode kind of dovetails with that certification episode. This period of time was really like the decade before I began certification. So I climbed my first high altitude peak in '94. I didn't start my certification until 2004, and it was that decade where my entire focus was altitude, making terrible decisions and getting the shit completely kicked out of me and making good decisions and building a foundation of skills and confidence at altitude.
And, do you think it was because your experience in Ecuador and because of your mentor, Chris, that your guiding path kind of took this altitude track? Because, a lot of guides out there never climb altitude in their entire career. It's not a requirement of the guiding curriculums. And, many, many, many guides are guiding in much different environments that don't have anything to do with altitude.
Yeah, it was very much, I think, those foundational pieces and just the fact that I loved what I felt were bigger problem solving shit shows. I might have already used that word a few times. I just loved how much was kind of out of our control in foreign countries with limited information and no comms, all the things I just said a couple of minutes ago. And the fact that we spent weeks with our teammates and clients and they became real friends versus day guiding. I did end up doing a lot of day guiding, especially as I started my certification process, spending time in Europe, living in Chamonix, meeting my clients in the morning, doing an objective, finishing that day, or at most maybe the next day. And much of that was way more technical, or,
Hmm.
Alaska heli ski guiding, or all these different things, more technical styles of guiding. But it didn't connect with me in the same way as expedition guiding did. So I don't know whether it had to be high altitude, but I loved the complications and the relationships of expedition guiding.
Yeah,
How about you?
absolutely. Well, I think for me, starting my guiding career along with having a family, it's a little bit different.
Mm,
I love, I've been to Ecuador guiding a few times, and I love, like you said, building those relationships and kind of the other factors to an expedition that aren't just the climbing. I think the travel and the culture and all of that is such a fantastic part, and to be able to see the world through an activity is my favorite thing. And so whether
totally.
that's traveling in a third world country and climbing at altitude, or traveling through Europe and using skiing as your mechanism, just having an activity to explore the world is really what I love. Um, that said, I'm not going to be spending the next year on the road traveling from expedition to expedition based on the other aspects of my life.
Yeah, it makes a load of sense. I mean, we're kind of back in the mountain guide world again, but like it is interesting seeing like mountain guides who choose high altitude guiding. You just have to be willing to spend months away and sacrifice a lot of those other things that I now as a 48-year-old recognize are really important to a full life that in my 20s and 30s I just had to sacrifice in order to be at the top of this game and achieve the things I wanted to achieve. But so should we talk a little bit about acclimatization? How to?
Yeah, absolutely. How do you
Let's do.
acclimatize?
I mean, because I think it is probably the biggest part of uncertainty that people come to Alpenglow expeditions with, whether it's people going on their first trip to Ecuador or Mexico or Bolivia, the place where we run climbing schools at altitude, or it's people planning Everest or wanting to attempt, the recent call we got that wanted to attempt K2 without supplemental oxygen. It's like everyone on that spectrum is like uncertain about how their body will perform and how to I, game the system isn't right, but like stack the odds in their favor for a successful expedition. So let's talk a little bit about that. And we won't be super scientific. I think that's important. Monica, our expedition doctor at Alpenglow Expeditions, is not on this episode, but will be on a future episode. And she always gets really annoyed at me when I talk about science, like I know what I'm talking about. I am not a medical doctor or a scientist, and basically don't have a clue. But I have a lot of anecdotal knowledge.
Yeah.
So the process of acclimatization, first in the very short term, in the first 24 to 72 or 96 hours, when we move to a new altitude, our body makes lots of rapid changes, adjusting the pH in our blood to more effectively be able to carry oxygen from the lungs to the muscles and brain and all the parts of the body that need oxygen. We're going to adjust like pressures in our capillaries and blood vessels for the same thing. We're going to increase our heart rate and respiratory rate. These are like rapid changes that allow us to survive at a new altitude, provided the bump up wasn't too big. Uh, but those short changes, actually, a lot of what we're doing in places like on a week-long trip to Cotopaxi or whatever, that's all we're doing is making those quick changes. The longer and more effective change is building more red blood cells. So when we're at sea level or low altitudes, we don't want really thick blood with too many red blood cells. Red blood cells are the little trucks that carry oxygen from our lungs to our muscles and brain. We don't want too many. That's actually bad for efficiency of the system if the blood is too thick. But at these new higher altitudes, if we have more trucks, more capacity, we can move more oxygen from the alveoli to the places that need it. That is what I would call the best type of acclimatization that we want. The problem is it can take weeks and it can really vary amongst people and based on your health and your diet and your iron levels, and how much rest you're taking. Can your body be building these new cells and putting them into use? uh, that's the slow acclimatization. That's what we want for the tallest mountains in the world, especially without supplemental oxygen, but it's slow.
Okay, and so what does a schedule of acclimatization look like for, say, a 20,000 foot peak? Like, how long does that process take?
Yeah, so again, loads of variability out there, but we'll talk about the averages. And when you're picking, little push for Alpenglow, like when you're picking a guide company, you want a guide company that's thought really hard about what the acclimatization schedule is going to be that works for a majority of the team. So Alpenglow will never guarantee, 100% success. Everyone who goes on this trip is going to acclimatize. That's impractical for lots of reasons, but altitude being a big one. But at the same time, if the company's only summiting 25% of their team, but say they have a, speed ascent, well, that's kind of stupid. Like, unless you're going to be part of that 25% to acclimatize really, really quickly. So, we're looking for schedules where, let's say, at least 80% of the team on average is going to have acclimatized well and safely for the trip, and hopefully closer to 90 or 100, as close to 100 as we can get without being there weeks longer than everyone needs to be. There is a certain percent of the population that just needs private trips purely because of the special acclimatization schedules they need. So just because, again, if any listeners out there, just because you failed on a mountain before, or I hear the story all the time. Oh, I can't climb high altitude peaks because I went to Aspen or Telluride and felt like shit. It's like, well, yeah, you probably flew from sea level, went to 9,000 feet, went out that night, had a bunch of beers, and then woke up at 8 in the morning and went skiing. No, no kidding, you felt like shit. Like, you needed a slower acclimatization schedule and slightly more responsible decision making along the way. And so, just because you've suffered before doesn't mean you can't do these trips. Um, that was a long
Okay, enough
precursor
selling.
to. No, I also think it's just important because literally 20% of people who hear what I do a lot of corporate speaking and I go to these groups of people who don't necessarily do these sports very often. And 20% of people who come up to take photos or ask questions are like, oh, I can't go to altitude because X happened.
Hmm.
Um, and it's like, well, no, you probably can. You just needed a little different schedule. So
Yep.
try again. Um, but the schedule that works, let's say 20,000 foot peaks, the majority of people, it's going to take about a week to be able to sleep at the altitude you need to, which let's say that's 3 to 4,000 feet below the summit, to then go and make the summit. So my experience is it's not actually the summit day that most people experience high altitude sickness, because while you're moving, climbing on summit day, your heart rate and respiratory rate are naturally elevated from the exercise. So if you put a pulse oximeter on, your oxygen sats are actually decent while you're moving, but when you stop, they plummet because your heart rate and respiratory rate can no longer make up for your lack of acclimatization. And so it's the night before that often ruins people, that last night sleeping on the mountain. So most 20,000 foot peaks, that night's going to be at 16 or 17,000 feet. That's where we need you acclimatized to. For most people, that's going to take somewhere in the vicinity of a week.
And that's coming from sea level. So if you live in a place like Tahoe, 6,000 feet, uh, can you get away with a couple fewer days?
Definitely. I mean, every bit of acclimatization helps. And so, certainly coming not from sea level is going to be an immediate benefit. And then things like I kind of, making fun of the person who went to Telluride and didn't do things right. Things like hydration, nutrition, sleep, not coming in with a cold or a flu or a gastrointestinal issue, um, and staying away from things like alcohol. Um, those things are going to massively help your body to be able to make the rapid changes that it needs to this extreme shift in environment.
Okay, and so if a 20,000 foot peak is going to take about a week, what about a 23,000 foot peak? Are we talking
Yeah.
about like 2 or 3 extra days?
No, that's a great point. So each bump up in altitude becomes remarkably more difficult for your body to make the adjustments it needs to and slower. So while we would regularly run a 9-day trip to one 20,000 foot peak in Ecuador, the traditional trip to, let's say, Aconcagua, 23,000 feet, would be 21 to 25 days long, like much longer. Um, and it's because that progressive, yeah, bump that you need just takes more time. It's more difficult for your body to make, and it's more difficult for you to put yourself in the position where it realizes it needs to make it. The way we acclimatize, the single gold standard to acclimatization, is to progressively move higher to where your body feels the suffering of not being acclimatized. That stimulates hormones, which tell your body it needs to make more red blood cells and make these other physiological changes. And then we need to drop back down low enough on the mountain that the body is not struggling. So you need to go back down to an altitude where your body is completely or mostly comfortable, and then rest and sit around and do nothing so your body can put all its energy and resources into making those changes, then go up again, not to the altitude you went before, but progressively a bit higher to where once again hormones are stimulated to tell your body make more changes, then go back down and rest and do it over and over and over again. So you can imagine that process is easier to do to 16,000 feet than it is to 18 to 20 to 22 to 24. When we attempt things like Everest without supplemental oxygen, we need to do that process all the way to over 26,000 feet or 8,000 meters. So we'll have gone all the way. We've essentially summited another 8,000 meter peak, another 26,000 foot peak during our acclimatization to stimulate the changes we need. And then we have to drop all the way back down the mountain. And in my years of trying without supplemental oxygen, I found that base camp at 17,000 feet wasn't even low enough to truly make to have my body be completely at rest to be able to build new red blood cells. So we started driving Jeeps down lower down the mountain to towns at below 14,000 feet and then all the way back up again.
Wow. And so how long would you spend in those lower towns?
Not long, 3, 4 days, 2, 3
Mm-hmm.
nights.
Sounds like a
Just,
long time to me.
I mean, those are magical days. You feel just amazing. And the funny thing is, like, every year on this mountain, even when I'm climbing with oxygen, I get to the point on Everest where I would look you in the eye at 21,000 feet at advanced base camp and be like, I'm completely normal now. I feel completely normal. I'm sleeping well. I'm eating well. I can have a beer or a glass of wine with dinner at 21,000 feet, higher than any of the mountains in Ecuador. But it's a total lie. The truth is that my brain has just adapted to this is normal, because as
Mm-hmm.
soon as I drop down and get a real night's sleep or eat a real meal, I'm like, oh shit, I actually felt terrible up there. And I just learned to tell myself that I felt normal.
It's a really interesting dynamic between, at what level are you finding that maximum recovery without losing the acclimatization benefits, and for how long and at what times. And I'm sure it's a fine line. If you spend too much time down low, then your body starts to lose those red blood cells that you've just created by going high.
Totally. It's and again, we'll get back to the science part in a second, but like, yeah, I mean, I have great friends who took this system all the way to on the south side of Everest, that they would actually come down and take helicopters back to Kathmandu, because if recovering at 14,000 feet was better, well, recovering at sea level must be best in a five-star hotel with a pool. And so they would go all the way back, but then silly things would happen, like bad weather would come and they couldn't helicopter back to the mountain. And
Mm.
so instead of 2 nights down, they spent 5 nights down, and they were screwed. You know, like,
Wow.
there is such a thing as too much.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right where that line is. And again, that line might be different for every person, especially like I see a lot having to do with age. An older person, the recovery side might actually be more important than their acclimatization side. And so you need to be kind of, there is no magic bullet. And I remember this when I shifted from climbing with oxygen to without. I, of course, asked like the 11 people I knew who had summited Everest without supplemental oxygen. And what I learned really quickly was they all did really different things. And none of them, there was no clear answer to what is best practices to climb Everest without supplemental oxygen. And that was really frustrating. Like, I'm a logical guy. I just want the answers. Um, so yeah, it's still a game as to what is right about this. And again, one of the challenges has been there's been so little science done at these extreme altitudes. It's been quite a bit of science done at like the altitudes of Denver and Mexico City and things like that. And there's currently more science being done because of especially the US military thinking that they might need to send soldiers to high altitude locations in the world one day. And so they're starting to test lots more about what works in acclimatization, how fast people can go to how high, and how effects of things like drugs like Diamox and Dexamethasone, and how things like pre-acclimatization in hypoxic tents can aid those soldiers. And so I think in the next decade, we're going to get a massive new body of research. Right now, a lot of the research is anecdotal from guys like me that love to talk about it.
Yeah. Okay. So you talked about some of the ways to cheat the system, right? Diamox, dexamethasone, pre-acclimatization. Let's dive in. The magic pill. What's the magic pill just to make this faster for me?
Yeah. And so as we go into these sort of aids that can aid us in acclimatization, really important to say once again, the gold standard: climb slowly, gain altitude slowly. The official recommendation is no more than 1,000 feet a day. Um, and then if you feel symptoms of acute mountain sickness or basic high altitude sickness like headaches, nausea, fatigue, um, things like that, you descend until you feel better and then you come back up. Uh,
I like how
that
you said AIDS and I said cheat the system.
Totally. Yeah. But so we've covered the gold standard and what we know works first. But then, of course, there are things that can speed our acclimatization. And I think the three main ones that we should mention, all the three I just said: Diamox, dexamethasone, pre acclimatization, and hypoxic tents. So, uh, Diamox, or the generic name acetazolamide, an incredible, very safe prescription drug that has been used by people for decades. It was originally prescribed for glaucoma. And so people are on it for life, which is nice. We know not only is it not bad for you when you take it for 3 days, it's not bad for you if you take it for years. So it's a very safe drug for most people. Sulfa allergies, can't take it, consult your doctor, all that good stuff. We're not professionals. But essentially speeds or aids the initial stages of acclimatization. This is not helping us build new red blood cells. This is helping us in those initial things like adjusting pH of our blood, raising our heart rate and respiratory rate, just making the system that we have more efficient. Um, and so it works really effectively in those initial days at a new altitude. There was a period of my career where I took it for every single trip starting 48 hours before, because that's what my mentor told me to do. And I'm like, ah. And then finally I was like, I should try without. And it turned out it was totally fine. We now don't generally prescribe it prophylactically or before you have symptoms. If someone has altitude symptoms, because it turns out they're on the end of the spectrum that needs a little more time, Diamox can help to bring them up to a more normal schedule of acclimatization. Um, it does dehydrate you. You have to wake up and pee a lot. It makes Coca-Cola and beer taste terrible, but it is a fantastic piece of the puzzle when we need it.
Yeah, I agree. Fun little story. I was guiding in Ecuador in last November, and I'd actually never taken Diamox before. A co-guide of mine always takes Diamox. He lives down in Chile. He always takes Diamox. He forgot his Diamox. And he actually likes to take it on the mountain, just a little bit of an extra bump to help him just not have some of those symptoms of altitude sickness. He asked me if I had any Diamox. I had a little bit. And generally, I get a really bad come down headache.
Mm,
The science behind that is when I'm climbing, I'm breathing harder, so I'm getting more oxygen. When I'm descending, I'm not breathing as hard, and therefore that headache starts to hit me. It's always been something that I've had every climb I've done. I've gotten a come down headache. Anyway, I went to give him a Diamox pill. Two fell into my glove. My glove was a bit wet. It would be irresponsible to put it back in the baggie. It would be irresponsible to throw it away. So I popped it, and I didn't get that come down headache. I
mm,
felt great coming down, and I just it was very effective very quickly just by taking one pill. So
mm.
it's a good tool.
Great tool. And as we start talking about this, I can't wait to see the comments we get about doping. So maybe we can just address that really quickly. But I do think it's an important topic. Of course, we are not again a judged, regulated sport, and so it's all up to our own ethic and kind of the community of what is doping, what is not. Uh, my stance has been like, is it allowed or is it not allowed by like let's say the International Olympic Committee or something like the Tour de France, things like that. So Diamox, not doping, probably also tells you it doesn't help you that much unless you're symptomatic with acute mountain sickness symptoms. And that brings us to the next one. Are we good? Next one.
Yeah, dexamethasone. It's just like a more powerful Diamox, right?
Right. So dexamethasone is really different. I guess since we let in this way, first of all, it's doping according to all those organizations I just mentioned. It's a corticosteroid that absolutely enhances performance, and it enhances performance in a dramatic way at altitude. That is not me telling people not to use it because, again, we are not a regulated sport, but that might be something you consider in how you approach the ethics of the sport. And it also might be something you consider in terms of safety because clearly it's a stronger effect, which also might have potential downsides we can talk about. Um, it's not something you'd want to be on for a long time because it's a steroid. Uh, it the other downside you hear a lot about in the mountains is it's a super important piece of the treatment of someone who gets high altitude cerebral edema, and if someone is already on it, it might lose some of its effectiveness for treatment, and that might mean the difference between getting someone down off the mountain and not. So those are a couple of things to consider, but it is now being prescribed by high altitude medicine specialists for people who are allergic to Diamox, and there have been a lot of initial studies suggesting that it could be a very effective prophylactic drug in the right amounts and with the right sort of like oversight. I think Dr. Peter Hackett has done some initial studies in this and supports the use of dexamethasone. So I'm not saying don't use it, but I am absolutely also not saying use it. And this is one you should definitely consult with your doctor with. I can tell you at Alpenglow and in my guiding, we would never use it prophylactically unless there was someone with an allergy and it was determined it was really necessary. And it's not something I use for my personal climbs or athletic pursuits in the high mountains. But the way it works is essentially temporarily reduces swelling on the brain. So a vast majority of altitude symptoms come from fluid leaking out of the capillaries in the brain, the blood vessels in the brain, getting into the interstitial space between the skull, which cannot expand, and the brain, which is squishy. And then that fluid pushes on the brain, creating pain, headaches, confusion, death of cellular cells, things like that. Potentially very, very high altitude cerebral edema is intensely, potentially dangerous. And dexamethasone can reduce all those symptoms, also gives a nice feeling of euphoria, which could, help in kind of the dealing with suffering. Um, but it's the real deal. I'm not sure if you've given it before on trips or experienced it.
No, I haven't. Great story though that I've heard, and the individual remain nameless.
Wait, is it
But
me? It's not
no,
me.
it's not you.
Okay.
I heard a friend of ours though was on Denali, first experience at altitude, as a responsible backcountry enthusiast would, brought both Diamox and Dexamethasone, planned to take Diamox prophylactically, planned to have the Dexamethasone for emergency purposes. Um, Mistakenly mixed the two up. They both start with a D. Honest mistake. Was at 14 camp, felt great. Maybe it was a little bit of that euphoria. Realized at 14,000 feet that they were taking dexamethasone instead of Diamox.
Classic.
Made the right decision, I think, to come off of the dexamethasone, but all of a sudden they were at 14,000 feet and came off that steroid, and had a couple really challenging days as their body went through this uncomfortable process of
Yeah.
immediately acclimatizing to 14,000 feet.
Classic. Well, good responsible decision making right there. There was a period of time in the sport where all no oxygen ascents were made on dexamethasone. It was just kind of like a commonly used thing. I think that period of time has certainly changed, and I think that's a good thing for our sport. Um, and the way I've uh, given it many times over the years, not many times to my own clients, but many times, occasionally to my own clients, and many times to others on the mountain. And I've really been impressed as a treatment. I've seen it take unconscious people and bring them to consciousness, maybe not walking, but consciousness. And I've seen it bring conscious but not able to walk people to walking and able to aid in their own rescue from
Wow.
things like spending overnights out above 23,000 feet and things like that. So, especially in combination with oxygen, it's remarkable the power of the drug specific to high altitude. Um, but I think that also means it needs to be used with extreme caution and with like moral understanding of what you're doing when you choose to take it. That's
And a doctor.
Dex and a doctor. Yeah, I mean, we should say our guides do occasionally prescribe these things, but we do it with the prescription and medical orders of a doctor who oversees our program and is on a satellite phone, if not there in person, essentially prescribing through the guide. Um, and it's not done casually. So I think that is very important because you're essentially you could be masking symptoms that are very much trying to tell you something.
Yeah,
And
I hope to not use Dex because I think it just speaks to the severity of what's going on if you need to use it.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. So maybe that leads us. I, I need to get faster here, Sam. I'm sorry, I'm so slow. This is why it's better to have a guest because they don't talk as much as I do. Oxygen is kind of the next thing to discuss, right? I didn't put it in my list, but the ultimate doping in high altitude climbing is pure bottled oxygen. I feel like back in the day, people used to shy away from calling oxygen doping. And again, our sport is not regulated. So doping is not necessarily bad as long as we're honest about it, explain it, and put that asterisk next to our name, things like that. The vast majority of people will climb the highest mountains in the world with supplemental oxygen, and it's still really fucking hard and it's really fucking cool. And I don't think we should demean that in any way. But is it different than climbing without oxygen? Of course it is. And the main ways we're just adding oxygen back into the ambient air. It's not like scuba diving. We're not only breathing the oxygen from the bottle, we're taking the oxygen from the outside air, we're mixing it with pure 100% oxygen out of the bottle. That creates oxygen in the mask that's more similar to a lower altitude. It's not a direct line, so we can't just say, oh, you're breathing 3,000 foot lower than you actually are. It doesn't work that way. All we, but we know it's quite a bit lower. It's quite a bit
Yeah.
better. We're increasing that percentage. And so bottled oxygen, an incredible tool for when someone has some sort of altitude illness. It also opens up some higher mountains on a faster schedule than otherwise could be done or possibly done at all. Um, Anything else about oxygen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that like we're not climbing volcanoes in Ecuador on oxygen. Oxygen isn't even on those volcanoes. Typically, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but oxygen is going to be an emergency tool on 6 and 7,000 meter peaks, and it's going to be a standardized tool for the most part on an 8,000 meter peak. So, very few people are, I would say, I don't know of anyone that is starting a 7,000 meter peak with oxygen on or planning to use it at any point.
Well, welcome to the new world, Sam. That's so cute of
Anyway,
you.
there are peaks that are oxygen is that emergency tool, similar to Diamox or Dexamethasone. And then there are peaks where oxygen is a standardized tool.
Absolutely. And really important to call out the treatment like you did. Your guide company would be um, not doing their job to the greatest ability possible if they were on, peaks over certainly over 23,000 feet, perhaps over 20,000 feet without having some sort of oxygen system for emergencies. It is the single most effective tool for someone with altitude sickness while getting them lower. Of course, you're going to run out of it up there, so you can't just leave them there. They need to be in a helicopter or walking lower on the mountain while breathing oxygen, but it is the single most effective tool, and your team should have it if you're climbing at high altitudes. With that said, yeah, like we should do a whole nother podcast sometime with oxygen because it's so rad and interesting and how it's formed and the ethics around it. But currently, it's pretty common for most teams on 8,000 meter peaks to put on oxygen around 7,000 meters, 23,000 feet. Now, some people will sleep at 23,000 feet first to prove they're that acclimatized. Some people will only touch 23,000 feet, which means they're probably only acclimatized to 20. But all of this has changed through the past 50 years, right? It used to be standard you didn't put oxygen on until 8,000 meters on the tall peaks. And that meant the lowest 8,000 meter peaks were all climbed without supplemental oxygen. Now they're all climbed with. Um, that's more like ethics of oxygen in our sport. And I'd love to talk about that. We'll stay out of that because this is about acclimatization. Um, except to add that specifically to your point, we are noticing that altitude come lower and lower and lower. We're now seeing people put on oxygen at 20,000 feet on 8,000 meter peaks. And that means, of course, Sam, that the next time you go to Aconcagua, the tallest peak in South America, you will see many climbers, but from only a couple of specific companies putting on oxygen to now climb Aconcagua.
I'll just leave it at no comment.
No comment. I think that's perfect. But
Awesome. Well,
yep.
I'm not going to let you dive into rapid ascent and pre-acclimatization just because we're running out of time. We're going to do a separate episode on pre-acclimatization coming
My
in the near
baby.
future.
Yeah, we didn't even get there. That was the whole point. I mean, at least let me throw out. So this system that we pioneered over the past 15 years at Alpenglow Expeditions has reduced the time on expeditions anywhere from 30 to 50% and has proven to be safer than the traditional systems. So another important piece of the acclimatization puzzle that Sam promises I'm going to get to talk about soon.
We're going to do a full episode on it just for you so you can talk as long as you want.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Well, it's really cool. It's unique talking to you about altitude. You have so much experience from, what we consider entry level high altitude mountaineering in the 18s and 19s, all the way up to Mount Everest without oxygen. So, the spectrum is quite broad for you, and you have a wealth of knowledge. You've worked closely with experienced doctors like Monica Pires, who you mentioned, who've really studied this and know a lot about the scientific side of it. And then anecdotally, obviously, your experience is quite broad. You've seen hundreds of clients experience it as well as have your own personal experiences. So it's a cool topic, and obviously you're passionate about it too. We can just tell by how much you spoke and how fast you spoke.
Yeah, my podcasting voice and technique perhaps still needs some work. But yeah, thanks for letting me drone on. Thanks for letting me or telling me when it was time to stop. And yeah, I mean I am gosh, I just love high altitude climbing so much and the experiences we all go through there, and acclimatization is the basis of all of it.
Absolutely. Well, we do have to talk about rapid ascent. So more coming in the near future. Thanks for listening to episode 15 of the Duffel Shuffle. If you enjoy these episodes that are more educational and less storytelling, let us know in the comments. We hope you enjoy the episode and always appreciate feedback. And as always, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, rate us, and leave us a review. We'll be back with episode 16 in a couple weeks, so keep following along.